I cannot imagine talking about poetry without poetry itself. So that is why I will start, sorry, I will start with the poem by Wisława Szymborska, our Nobel Prize winner. Well, at first I'll read it. It's a part of the poem from the volume, from the book of poetry, the end and the beginning. Some people like poetry. Some people. That means not everyone. Not even most of them, only a few. Not counting school where you have to, and poets themselves, you might end up with something like 2,000 poetry. But what is poetry anyway? More than one rickety answer has stumbled since that question first was raised. But I just keep on not knowing, and I cling to that like a redemptive handrail. Pay attention, please, to 3 points in this poem. Only minority, the first one, only minority is interested in poetry, according to the poet. The second one, probably nobody knows what it is. All attempts of defining it are doubtful and indecisive. And finally, the voice in this poem doesn't want to know the definition of poetry. And, what is more, feels that ignorance is redemptive. Remember about this poetic manifesto during my talk, when I will try to answer the question and my answer will be probably rickety. As I'm going to present a scholar's view in poetry, of course, I'll also quote an academic voice that corresponds with this of a poet. Much critical work on children's poetry, indeed on poetry in general, begins with a lament. Poetry has lost its pride of place in culture at all levels. It is an unpopular form in the marketplace. It has become the insular property of creative writing programs and small presses, an elite product available only to the enlightened few who understand and can evaluate the good from the bad. If this marginalization from the mainstream is the case for poetry in general, the argument goes it is even more so for children's poetry, except that it is not, at least as far as the first two complaints go. I want to try to prove this sentence or the last sentence by Karen Coates, that it's really not true that poetry has lost the place in culture, that it's so unpopular, that it's so elite. I'd like to show you and to prove you that it could be, or it is actually, quite common, and not only for the elite. Even Morag Stiles, the unquestionable authority in poetry, in children's poetry, finishes her chapter in Hans' encyclopedia with the claim that poetry remains a minority interest and only a small number of people read, write, and buy it. Is it really true? I dare say, I dare say it is so common as no other text of culture may be comparable to fairy tales. It is also a universal forgotten language, as Erich Fromm wrote about fairy tales and dreams. It is a language of images too. I'm sure everyone here is able to quote a rhyme, verse, poem, song from his or her childhood. And they are in us. They work in us somehow, even though we may be unaware of it. So my first claim is, poetry is not for minority, and it's not a minority interest. We all, as children at least, are exposed to it, and we're prone to it. Pay attention also to the words by Coates here in this quote. Poetry in general. Karen Coates starts her article repeating it twice, this phrase. And of course, you've already noticed that I'm still talking about poetry and not specifically children's poetry that I'm supposed to talk about tonight. Well, this is partly because, sorry, I will try to do something because I cannot see my presentation, which is trouble. Okay. So partly it is because I'm not sure I believe in the very existence of children's poetry. And partly because if I assume that it exists, I want to believe it is just a part of poetry as such. And it should be treated like any other kind of poetic work. So here on this slide, you can see my paraphrase of the famous quote by Janusz Korczak, "There are no children, there are people." In my opinion, there is no children's poetry, there's poetry. And of course, it's not original. Even this undisputed authority, which I already quoted, Morag Stiles, wrote in Peter Hand's encyclopedia, "I am tempted to say there is no such thing as poetry for children." And it's not so difficult to prove it in practice, showing the examples of poets who wrote both for adults and for children, not telling the difference between them. My favorite Polish example is Joanna Kulmowa, who composed her selection of poetry from the poems previously published in the books for children, as well as the volumes without this address. I love her essays on poetry, and especially this one I quote here on this slide. It is an essay entitled "Is It Worth Writing for Children?" published in a Gulliver Polish journal on children's literature. I also like the answer of Crystal Howard in the latest Bloomsbury Handbook of Contemporary American Poetry, which you also can see on the slide, and her very short answer, well, I shortened it for the effect, sorry. So the question was, how does contemporary North American children's poetry differ from contemporary North American poetry for adults? Short answer was marketing. What do you think about it? I suppose it is some truth in it. Of course, it's not the whole answer, and to be faithful to the original, I will quote the rest of it. Which is here. The scholar also said about that it seems to be more of a focus on verse narratives and illustrated or picture book poetry for young readers, and less of a focus on poetry collections that are not illustrated. I suppose it is, and I will come back to this claim to the end of my talk. It is true, and probably as scholars, we should pay attention also to this issue, that poems for children, poetry for children, if they are such, they exist and they are read together with the illustrations and together with the pictures, with images. Another very interesting answer was by the Canadian poet, which is especially interesting for me because I think we should also listen to the poets themselves, how they perceive their role and how they what they say about their writing for children. So John Arno Lawson answered this question. This is a question I find harder to answer as time goes by. Maybe the biggest difference in terms of contemporary English language poetry is that poets who write for children tend to avoid deliberate obscurity. Yeah, so another issue we may discuss. if it's so different, because we may say there are also extremely simple poems not intended for children. Yeah. What I want you to show also on this slide is this book, this handbook, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Contemporary American Poetry, which was published last year. What's really interesting for me and important, that children's poetry is included in a book devoted to poetry in general. Yeah, so this is one of the examples, and it happens more and more often, which is also kind of a proof of my claim that there is just poetry, good or bad. On this slide, I wanted to present you also Polish examples of, on one side, including children's poetry into the volume, which is actually devoted to women poets of the 20th century, Polish women poets. And we have the a chapter written here by Agnieszka Kwiatkowska about children's poetry. Here we will have this term poetry for children. Again, I will come back to terminology, and I will try to discuss it for a while in a moment. And on the right hand, you have the latest volume, the latest book on poetry, this time only children's poetry. But for me, it's also, it may be a good example of interdisciplinary academic interest in children's poetry. And it shows that not only the scholars who specialize in children's literature want to study this subject, which is also good, I suppose, yeah, and very promising for our study. Now it's time to come back to the title of my talk. I'm sure you already know why I decided to speak about children's poetry as a challenge, starting with this poem by Szymborska. While preparing this talk and thinking about its title, I realized that my first association with the notion of children's poetry is actually a challenge. And it means there are still more questions than answers, in my mind at least. And after almost 20 years of working on children's poetry, on poetry as such, it's still work in progress. So I'd like you treat this lecture as a call for a discussion and the challenge for you as well. A challenge, the definition of this word, is a difficult task or problem, something that is hard to do. And many essays and research articles on poetry starts from this point. For example, Alice Landy, in the very beginning of the chapter on poetry, writes, "Today, poetry is often regarded as the most sophisticated or difficult of literary forms." Most of my students, both from philological and pedagogical faculties, agree with this statement. Poetry is a challenge for them, also as the future teachers. The actual teachers are of the same opinion, which may be confirmed by Alicja Ungehoyer-Gołąb, who wrote about her experience of reading lyric poetry with children in primary schools. And she wrote a few books about her experience and about her understanding of children's poetry in education, actually. So here you can see the covers of her books, as well as the cover of the oldest in this collection book by Alicja Baluch, who is the professor and the teacher also for Alicja Ungehoyer-Gołąb. So she started writing about children's poetry in Poland, especially this poetry without any Well, without speaking about its address, sometimes, again, it will be a kind of a leitmotif of my talk. We present children, we show children the examples of poetry, which was not intended for them. Yeah, and I don't know if there are any research on that, but probably even there are more poems not intended for children presented to them during their school education than poetry, especially written for the young. So poetry, I'm not going to talk about this aspect, I mean educational aspect, but I'd like only to mention that it is represented in Polish research, and it could be the subject of a separate lecture, as for 20 years I've been working with students and showing them the methods elaborated by Alicja Baluch and Alicja Mgłechojer-Gołąb, and I'm sure it is an important field to show how rewarding poetry classes with children can be. And I cannot resist the temptation to tell you an anecdote from my classes. Last week, I presented to my students a poetry book by Zofia Beszczyńska. It's lyric. There are lyric poems, definitely. And one of the students exclaimed, "What a pity! Nobody read such books to us when we were children." Great joy, really. And I was really happy hearing that. And I feel that she could be the person who will present also such poetry to her students, to her pupils. Well, so she will take this challenge also. When I'm thinking about children's poetry, I think also about the poets' voices. And when I think about them, and I wrote about it in my book, I have to somehow come back to the issue of the actual address of this poetry. According to my studies, most of good poets claim poetry is one. Yeah, and if you write for children or not for children, you are to treat it seriously. So, like in the first quote from our poet Mieczysława Buczkówna, poetry for children, it is a serious genre. So that's one thing, one point. And also, one of the Polish poets wrote even that only poets who write poetry in general should publish poetry books for children. So here I mentioned a few names of poets who wrote about children's poetry and wrote critically, claiming that most of the poetry books for children which were available in bookshops and in libraries are not poetry, indeed, are not good enough, and it's a shame that just poets who are, according to them, real poets, yeah, and just feel that it's their form to express themselves, should write also for children. That's another thing I'd like to stress, I'd like to emphasize. I also wrote in my book about publishing houses policy, according to which publishing poetry, especially lyric poetry, is not profitable, which means it's risky and it's really hard to publish a poetry book also for children if you are not classic. Yeah, Brzechwa, or Tuwim in Polish case. Polish classics. So to present you something, what it means that poetry, children's poetry, could be a challenge for the editors for publishing houses, I'd like to show you the case of actually the challenge which was taken by a representative Polish publishing house, Biuro Literackie. This publishing house publishes mainly poetry in general. Let's keep this term. And have a look here on this slide. The first, there are a few things I want you to show here. The first one is are these titles. These are at first the title of a book series, which is presented here, which is called in Polish Dzieci Nada, so it could be translated into English as childishness, which is a little bit disrespectful, or even self-deprecating attitude to such books. What's more, the publisher decided to call it using two diminutives. Sorry. It's like little books and little verses. Książeczki, wierszyki. Again, the same attitude. And it's kind of contradictory. When we can see, when we look at these editions, which are here on the slide, which are great editorial work, and they are careful, I would say, model editions with great illustrations. And what's more, the third thing, all authors of the presented books are well-known, appreciated poets, and they publish just one or two books for children. So it's just a different audience for them, just for a while. But many, if not all, features of their poetry are also in these children's books to be found. So another proof that the poetry is just poetry. I also want you to have a look at the first book, because it's a very interesting example of an anthology, and not anthology of classical poems, of the poems which are learned by heart by students, and for years already, but they are new poems written by contemporary Polish poets, not writing. Most of them haven't written poems for children so far. And what's more, every poem is illustrated by another artist. So it's a kind of a complex idea to present both a picture, an image, and the text. To the end of my lecture, I will try to show you also these poetry picture books, but different ones. So just now, I just wanted to say that poetry for children, especially nowadays, but not only, of course, is strictly connected to the image, to pictures, to arts, simply, and the also the whole book design. Sorry. And what about children? Children themselves. I was talking about the challenges for many, poetry as a challenge for many different people somehow involved in this industry, let's say, and in this subject. What about children? Is it also a challenge for them, or it's natural? like Janusz Korczak wrote that children truly are poets, or Karen Coates discussed in one of the chapters of her book, Are Children Natural Poets? She presented different approaches to this problem, to this issue. Alicja Ungehoyer-Gołąb, whom I've already mentioned, proved in her books and her articles that children's responses to poetry and to lyric poetry, which many adult teachers treat as, well, quite difficult, that children's responses are really great and are very spontaneous, of course, and they can teach us, adults. They can inspire us also in our understanding of poems, of poetic work, of poetic expression. So, and last but not least, poetry written by children. I wrote here also a Polish term, which I propose maybe, poezja dzieci, because we are talking about children's poetry, poezja dziecięca, and we may think it's also poetry written by children. Yeah, so maybe we will need another term to differentiate this poetry, which is more and more recognized by scholars and by adults. It is represented, it is published in Poland rather locally, I would say, in not many. It's published by libraries after some competitions, poetry competitions, but not only. Here you can see a few examples from Anglophone area, and you can see that they are not rare, I would say. There is also this beautiful and very inspiring, interesting book by Rachel Conrad, whose quote is here on the slide. You may read it. It corresponds, the quote from the book and the whole book, the whole idea which is behind this book, I believe, corresponds with the statement of Korczak, who wrote a lot about this children-adults relationship and the need of acknowledging them as full persons, as people, not just a little phenomena which may or develop into people. No, they are actual people, and they have also something important to say. I would say also in poetry. It's not my field of interest, although I think I should talk about it and mention it while talking about poetry for children, children's poetry, because it's a very important field of interest also for the scholars. Finally, what I'm most interested in, children's poetry as a challenge for scholars and critics. I want to start with this great metaphorical statement by Joseph Thomas, that children's poetry is the shabby stepdaughter of the children's literature discipline, and to those who study poetry for adults, it's the miller's third son's cat, and before he got those big buckled boots. As a result, children's poetry hasn't got much critical attention over the years. And this is the statement from last year. Yeah. So we may say it's up to date. Well, I'm not sure if it's really like that. I suppose the situation improves. I had an immediate association with the metaphor which was popular in Polish children's literature studies, where children's literature was compared to Cinderella. So here we have another or other fairy tales characters. It is a challenge then, and it is still in front of us to try to attempt to answer the questions. And some of the problems I wrote here again on this slide, some of them I will try to discuss briefly, of course, because I can see I have to finish. So the problem of definition. So the first thing, what it actually is, children's poetry, yeah? And it is connected with other problems which are mentioned here. So the problem of the term. I've noticed that it's actually probably a Polish problem. Correct me if I'm not right. I mean, people from other countries, if you have also terminological problems. I mean, in Polish, there are still heated discussions if it's children's poetry or poetry for children. And the difference is, there is a slight difference, yeah? And according to Richard Waxmund, who is still quoted, children's poetry is more artistic, yeah, generally speaking. And poetry for children has this pedagogical, educational aim in the first plane. So these are two terms which could be used in Polish literary studies, and we are not sure which one is proper, and maybe there should be another term which we will use, or maybe it's just an academic discussion and we should leave it. We are also talking about verses for children or rhymes for children, which are not actual poetry, which is something less, which are just, rhyming sentences. And again, is it right? Especially if we are thinking about these children's lore, which is another point. Counting out rhymes, old songs, and playground rhymes. So that's the problem. And what about this poetry, which I've already mentioned, not intended for children, but included in children's books of poetry? The last question, I'm leaving without the answer, definitely. Maybe in discussion we will talk about it. Does children's poetry critique exist? Is it something like that? Because, of course, we have poetry critique, yeah, for adults. What about children's poetry? And would it be useful? Yeah. I would like to show you also my concepts, and are they new? You may judge. I would say that I wanted to reverse the problem, yeah, and not talking only about children's poetry, but also about poetry from the adult point of view. So, like family poetry, which is to be read together. Which has at least this dual address, like we have family movies, family films, or even parents' poetry. On this slide, I'm presenting you the books of poetry from different times. Classical already, Władysław Broniewski, Julian Kornhauser, and Anna Podczaszy, who is contemporary Polish. All of them are somehow contemporary, but she's the youngest, and it's her first children's book. I would call it parents' poetry, which expresses parents' experience. It is often expressed and showed by the dedications to children, to grandchildren, in Broniewski's case. And it is very specific. I mean, and subject themes are tone also. So maybe it could be used also as a term for poetry written for the young. I was writing also in the title of my talk about this cultural phenomenon. And it is also, I think you already could hear it in my talk, that I treat poetry, especially maybe this children poetry, as a very important part of cultural heritage, of cultural tradition. And I would say there are a few points. Again, I will I wrote them on this slide. So the first one is the phenomenon of childhood poetry. Yeah, so poetry, which most of us came across during our childhood. And these are especially lullabies. Katarzyna von Dolny-Tatar wrote that about every genre, but especially maybe this one, that it's a kind of a vehicle for transmission the cultural content and literally cultural tradition. And I totally agree that that's it. Yeah, and especially this genre, which is so different from the very beginning. If you think about the history of children's poetry, most of us would start with lullabies. Yeah, so that's a great phenomenon in our culture, not only poetry or literature. Another thing, schoolroom poetry or schoolroom poets. I will show you this on the next slide in a moment. Children's lore I've already mentioned, or multicultural track that was called like that by Michael Joseph in Routledge Companion to Children's Literature last year. I'd like to present you also something which I call the phenomenon of the covers and translations as opportunity for a cross-cultural medium. Maybe it would be too much, but these are just mentions. And now just a few words about classics and about the schoolroom poetry. Yeah, the schoolroom poets. You have here two nice editions of two main romantic Polish poets. The poems were chosen by eminent Polish scholar Grzegorz Leszczyński. And also latest edition, maybe the classics for children. And this English edition here is especially interesting because it was created in the 20s of the 20th century. And now, a few years ago, it was published once again with the subtitle, as you can see, maybe Poems Old and New Selected for Boys and Girls. And imagine that there is, for example, the poem by Coleridge, which is absolutely, and in my opinion, not for girls and for boys and girls. Anyway, it's this schoolroom poetry that also Michael Joseph is writing about. And what to do with it? Is it children's poetry? Of course not. So how to present this poetry, if probably it's even if not the most, it's really huge part of poetry that we present to children and that children actually like, which are also research on that. A few words about children's folklore. Again, I'm hurrying up. So another thing we have to look at carefully. I remember my surprise and great amazement when in 2012 this book, which is here on the slide on the left, which are counting out rhymes, became a Polish bestseller. And it was really a marketing success. there were a few other volumes of these counting our crimes. So here you can see on the right, you can see also latest book, academic book on this kind of poetry, which we cannot miss somehow. Yeah. I also want to present you, of course, we are talking how to talk about nursery rhymes again. It proves, in my opinion, that it's not just children's poetry, yeah? But it could be published like that by putting such illustrations or editing, publishing such books like here. I wanted to show you this Polish translation, or rather adaptation, I would say, of the most popular English nursery rhymes by Małgorzata Strzałkowska, because it's also the example, it could be the example of my notion, which I tried to show in one of my articles, of children's covers, let's say, all ages covers. I treat the cover as, you know, it's in music, a musical cover, as a remake or revival, new performance by the author other than the original one, and updating, new interpretation. Here you can see the Hoffman's book, and also one of the books by Julian Tuwim, but actually it's completely another collection of poetry, and not only poetry. So that's why I decided to call these books covers, and I really like this notion of, which is rooted, I think, in Scandinavian literary studies, all ages literature. I feel that this kind of poetry, this kind of presenting poetry to children, is actually also has at least this dual address, and I would call it all ages poetry or covers. And my last statement and proposal, or how to read or how to talk about children's poetry. Also, I would talk maybe more nowadays about poetry books than just poetry, and then children's poetry. And I would try to read them as a few, okay, maybe not many scholars nowadays already do, to read poetry books as iconotexts. Here you can see one of latest Polish poetry books, which is definitely to be read like this. You cannot miss, and you cannot neglect this graphic, this images, yeah, and the whole design of the book, as you can see on the slide. And finally, poetry picture books. What are they? Here I wanted to show you two picture books by our eminent artist, Iwona Chmielewska, which are special also because, in my opinion, they are not intended for children, or not only for children. And actually the adults could appreciate these two volumes. The poetry are by different women poets, and Iwona Chmielewska prepared or created these poetry picture books using these texts. So they are completely different books, which may be interpreted and may be analyzed in a completely different way than the poems which are the basis of the or which are the text of these books. I'd like to finish my talk again with a poem. This time it's a poem by a 13-year-old boy, because I think it would be fair. Of course, it's not, toute proportion gardée, it's not Szymborska. Anyway, it is somehow similar. You will judge it. Finally, I got a clear sight of my destination in the distance. I'm going the road not taken. What happened to lyric poetry? Since after all, lyric poetry is stupid. Poets also are stupid. And there is wisdom in it, dear Lord. The world view shattered, the whole road crumbled, but I'm happy now as I'm stupid. I am. Amen. I believe there is wisdom in children's poetry, created both by adults and children. And I'm also convinced it has much to offer, not only to the young. Thank you very much. I hope you are not asleep already.
Thank you. No.
Sorry,
Thank you for this wonderful talk.
It was sorry, it was too long probably, but I couldn't.
It was too short.
Sorry.
It was really, really interesting. So many important things that you mentioned and reminded us that poetry is such a huge and important area of research. So thank you very much, because I think it opened eyes for many of us. So many things to to talk about.
Thanks.
Now we have time to discuss.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes,
I agree. Such a beautiful presentation. I really loved it, and the structure was just incredible. And the way you began with Szymborska and you finished with this real example of children's poetry. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that there are many questions.
Thanks a lot. I'm waiting impatiently.
I only want to remind you that you can raise your digital hand, or you can write your question or comment in the chat. We have the first person here, Marina. Hello.
Hello, it's good to see you.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Thank you, Krystyna. It was amazing. First of all, it's really windy here because I am at the beach. So please tell me, can you hear me right?
How could you?
I am really into poetry. Well, I study Latin American and particularly Argentinian lullabies. So it was really interesting and fundamental things you said for me. And at least in Spanish, meaning mainly in Spain and in Latin America, I have read that poetry studies in general, I mean poetry studies for adults as well, emphasize on the importance of voice, human voice, which I think is a topic that we cannot neglect. So how do you think we can understand this phenomenon of human voice and the inherent orality that lies within every poem in these new texts that you, Krystyna, pointed out that we should study not only as poems, but mostly as books of poems? How do we study the voice or the orality in those books that also have design and illustrations?
Thank you very much for this question. Am I to answer just now or wait for other questions? Yes?
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's a great question. I haven't time to mention that we should actually treat poetry not only as the whole, as the artistic whole of the text and image, but actually the musicality. Yeah. So what you are talking about orality, I would add that all poetry is somehow musical. it's based on and rooted in the rhythm. Yeah. So I also haven't mentioned that I think it's very important, especially now when we have Nobel Prize winner Bob Dylan, who is a singer, that it's really worth discussing, analyzing, interpreting poetry, also children's poetry, in terms of its musicality. And there are so many poems that, as you said, you can hear the human voice in it. So I would say it's also great to be able and to teach maybe also as students that every poem should be read aloud, yeah, or sang. I'm also very much interested in reading poetry by the poets. Because it's also completely different, experience. Yeah, when you listen to the poet, even if he or she has no talent for reading, but it's something special, don't you think so? So. Yeah, thank you very much. It's very important, and I think it's also worth discussing, worth serious research.
Thank you very much for your answer. Yes, I think it's really important. Thank you. I will take note of that.
Thanks.
Yes, and poetry read by the poets, as you said. Now we have this case in Poland, Szymborska's poetry read by Szymborska, even on TV. Yes, in advertisements they use her voice, and it's like magic when you hear her reading her poetry work. We have
and now with YouTube, you can listen to these recordings. It's all accessible, so that's a great point.
We have two more questions from Mocht. Sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, but please. Hello, are you?
Hello, am I visible? Am I audible?
Hi. Yes, you are.
Okay, so that is an abbreviation to Mohammed, and I am from, so in order to make my name a bit shorter, I did it. So that's a mistake on my part. Anyway, wonderful presentation, Professor Zabawa, and I was like, I'm a postgraduate student here in the Aligarh Muslim University in India, and I have just recently convened a conference on children's literature. So that was like a first of its kind conference in the country. We have been through animation, graphics, but having children's literature as the main center was for the very first time. And today, when I attended your lecture, I joined like 10 minutes late, and I'm very apologetic for that. But yeah, I took down the notes, and there's one thing that I found very much interesting, and that is when you introduced family poetry and the parents' poetry. So my question is, like, is it only in the Poland that we are moving into that fashion, or is there similar kind of literature that is available, especially in English literature? And I have another observation to make. That is, like, when you said that children's literature or literature by children. So that is not only subjective to the Polish literature, I guess, but here in India, we have like so many languages all under one. So that is the case with even my own language, that is Kashmiri, that I'm into, and also in English. So yes, if we can have a talk on that topic as well.
Well, I'm not sure if I am an expert at the poetry of other countries or English-speaking Anglophone poetry, but I may say that for sure, for example, Michael Rosen, we were talking about before the lecture, wrote also such poetry, which I could call family poetry, yeah, and he also used and uses his fatherhood experiences in his poetry. Yeah, so also in his amazing and touching, moving picture books. So I suppose that yes, it's not only Polish phenomenon. Yeah, it's I suppose also characteristic for the whole also Anglophone poetry. Yeah, and it's great to hear that in India it's also the similar. Yeah. And I suppose it's really a great trend, yeah, to that there are so many poets and writers in general who start to write for children, let's say, after experiencing their being parents, yeah, or grandparents. So it is something in it, yeah, and we may try to discuss it in such a way, in my opinion. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, one follow-up, if I'm allowed.
Of course.
Okay, thank you. So are you of the opinion that parents' poetry or family poetry will in turn be didactic, not only for the children who listen to it, but also for the parents? Like,
exactly. That, well, I love it. I wrote a paper on it. I mean, the paper about one of the Polish poets I also mentioned, Joanna Miller. And I think it's exactly like that. It's didactic, but like, Roald Dahl books, they are didactic for not only for children, but maybe mostly for adults. It's like with Janusz Korczak's works in Poland. They are actually for the teachers, for parents, for the adults, how to, create this relationship with children, yeah? And how to treat them seriously, how to treat them like people. And, so, yeah, great idea. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, Professor Zabawa, and the gentleman there. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
We have more raised hands here, and I can see Smiliana wants to say something, to ask or comment.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Krystyna, for such a lovely lecture. It was most interesting and so clearly presented, and you raised in such a gentle way so many serious questions regarding children's literature. Well, what I would like to do now is actually to focus on, there are so many aspects, of course, in your lectures that made me think about poetry and children's poetry, but I would like to focus on this distinction between children's and, let's say, adult poetry, which you, in fact, wish to remove in a way, saying, and I agree with you that poetry is poetry, but yet in some, at some point, you actually very convincingly mentioned children's poetry, as like lullabies are children's poetry, period. And you mentioned some poems which, in your opinion, are not for children. They're not addressing children. So I've been thinking about these two extremes when we talk about poetry, and about is it possible, perhaps, to, there are such terms as light verse, for instance, and we can't say that light verse is specific only for children's poetry, but it is very frequently also specific for some kinds of poetry addressing adults, or humor, or nonsense, or in particular, irony. For instance, Wendy Cope is extremely ironical poet, and she does not really, her humor is not addressed at children. You know what I mean? Yeah. So there are different phenomena regarding, in connection with poetry, which and poetry brings us different kinds of experiences and different kinds of perspectives, right? For instance, Roger McGough, right, who also brings, a very complex set of topics in maybe child-friendly and maybe not way. On the other hand, Michael Rosen, who does not use rhyme, and so on and so on. There are so many things that we could discuss. Well, to make a long story short, I would like to support you in considering poetry kind of expression which is very difficult to divide into two realms. But on the other hand, we can think about some common features of all the poems, and on the other hand, some of them that really belong to these two contrasted points. What do you think about this? If I haven't been too confusing, I'm sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Miana. Yeah, my aim, it was my aim actually, to provoke such a discussion. It was meant to be provocative at first. And I agree with you, of course, that there are two realms and somehow, but at the same time, we got used to think in oppositions, which is not okay, I think. We already, all these, we are already after all these deconstructionist thought, and we know that the opposition is always like that we neglect one, or we treat one side as an inferior and another side as a better one. So it's like with up and down, right and wrong, and left. And the same is with children and adults. Why Korczak stated there are no children, there are people? Because we tend to treat children as inferior, And the same is, I feel, with poetry, Children's poetry. That we feel that it's something worse, that it's something maybe not serious, which is not true, of course. But I definitely agree that there is something, Morag Stiles wrote that she would that she somehow doesn't believe in children's poetry, and she is professor of children's poetry. So we are still talking about it, and that's a kind of that's great. It's this work in progress. And as to lullabies, because you started with this, that it's children's, definitely intended for children, I wouldn't agree, because I would call it childhood poetry, yes, but not children's. Especially as this genre is evolving, which our colleague von Dolny Tatar showed us perfectly in her book. So I'm not sure if we can really say there are genres which are dedicated only to children. So it's so complex. The main aim of my talk was to show how complex subject it is, and how many different ways of interpreting, analyzing poetry we may take, So, and there are so many roads not taken, quoting once again Robert Frost. So, thank you very much. What about, you mentioned humor, nonsense, irony, which I haven't mentioned. And these are elements which have to be mentioned while talking about poetry. So thank you once again. And I feel it's something that also may differentiate or may show the differences between national poetries. In Poland, it's really not easy to find a poet who treat children, who show children's in poetry this irony, let's say, yeah. And it is already, as you've mentioned, in Anglophone, in English poetry. What's more, Morag Stiles wrote that English poetry came from the garden to the streets. And I would say that Polish poetry, yes, maybe it's left or is still leaving gardens, but it stays at home. It's safer, I would say. There are no such graphic topics like I can find in some American poems for children, which treat about abuse, about really, violence. Yeah. So it may help us also to show the specific features of national poetries. That's also what I'm talking about while talking about this cross-cultural potential of poetry. Yeah, one of my dreams is to live long enough to create something like an anthology of world children's poetry. Yeah. Also including Asian one, including different country cultures. It would be amazing because, again, latest companion to children's literature. I was a little bit disappointed, I must say, by Michael Joseph's essay, as it's only Anglophone poetry once again. Yeah, of course, it is multicultural. It is fascinating, but there are so many other ways of expression, so many other great poets. Yeah, so again, very long talk, but thank you very much. I appreciate your reflections. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. And now you've actually brought me to think about yet another aspect, and I will leave you with that, not as a question, just as a small comment. Well, maybe it depends on the readership, in fact. As one of my colleagues often says, he's an expert in children's literature, he often reminds us that children are not underdeveloped adults, which adults often think. But children are just a different kind, different species of humans. And it depends on what they receive and what they appreciate. So thank you so much once again for your response and for your really thought-provoking lecture. Thank you, Krystyna.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Smiljana.
Thank you, Smiljana, for your question and your comment. And we have another question from Marina again. Can you join us?
Hello, sorry. Actually, I wanted to answer to Mohammed because I think that at least in Argentina and also in Uruguay, perhaps, most of the books, illustrated books of poetry that are sold at the libraries, I think are what Krystyna has called family poetry, which I think is really nice, actually. And educational psychologists and art educators have founded what they call these reading groups that are called, or reading communities that are called reading nests, which are groups of people, of parents who come together and read these family poetry books, perhaps encompassing birth or labor or pregnancy. And it's really interesting, I think, because it has a social meaning as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for this comment.
It was just a comment, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. And another raised hand from Sylvia.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Sylvia.
Hello. Okay. Now I think you can see me.
Yeah.
Paul, thank you very much for your presentation and for all this information. In my experience, students often don't like poetry, and teaching it is difficult and tiring, probably for me and for them, for both parties. But I think they are really moved by some engaged poetry. I would say it also today's poetry. For example, about animal rights or the environment. And in Poland, for example, the poetry of Urszula Zajączkowska. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that certain topics are better to discuss with children, or should we be as diverse as possible? What are your thoughts about?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yeah, diversity is always the best, I think, in everything, and showing art to music, arts, literature, poetry as well. I agree with you that some subjects could be more interesting, but it depends on the age of your students. Yeah, I don't know what is the age of your students, but my experience is I wouldn't say teaching poetry, or I'd rather say playing with poetry. Yeah. And I always try to show it's not tiring for me. And if it's difficult, maybe to some extent, but if you show that it could be a kind of a play, it is a riddle, to be solved. So it doesn't matter what kind of subject you choose. If it's a real poetry, which means that there is something in between the words, yeah, that it's not literal, that you have to think somehow, that you have to put your experience into the poem. So I assure you that all young people and children will be satisfied with it, and they will play. They will give you so many excellent answers, excellent solutions to the riddles. Yeah, they may talk about different metaphors in a way that you wouldn't guess. Yeah. That's amazing. That's fascinating in our job, by the way, that we may learn from our students, even that if they are, I don't know, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, they are our teachers, and it's great to treat them as such. Yeah. That's the opportunity for us to also to develop somehow, and not to feel tired, and not to feel routine after 20 years of reading sometimes the same texts. If they are good, they are new all the time. Every year, every month, they are new for us. So yeah, thank you for your sharing your experience, and I wish you such great classes with poetry, because it is possible. I assure you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have one more question in the chat that appeared a few minutes ago. So I think that Mateusz will read it now.
Sure. So I'll read the question. I have a keen interest in poetry picture books. While many picture books feature a combination of illustrations and poems, verses, children's poetry picture books can be either nonfiction picture books or narrative poetry picture books. I would appreciate hearing your thoughts on the various types of these poetry picture books. What, in your opinion, makes a poetry picture book noteworthy? Do you have any recommendations for outstanding examples in this category? That was a long question.
Yeah, it is. And I'm not sure what country it comes from, because if I am to give you any examples, they will be rather examples from Polish market, let's say. So if it's a foreign listener, so it would be really difficult to give some examples. Maybe I would try to give some criteria how to know that this poetry picture book is a good poetry picture book. I would say that the first thing, the images should be as inspiring as the words. That's the first thing. Yeah, the images are not to be simple illustrations or just simple interpretations or of some words, phrases. I think they should be, as I said, equally involving, equally artistic, and inspiring. So that's the first and probably the most important thing if we are talking about picture books. And that's very complex subject again for another lecture probably, because there are so many, and I could notice the differences in treating poetry picture books in Anglophone literary studies and in market practice, because many editors, many publishing houses call some books picture books. And if we agree as scholars that they are picture books, it's another issue. Yeah. So it's as I said, very, very complex subject, as the question was quite complex. Yeah. So maybe that's it. I'm not sure if you are satisfied with my answer.
Yes, and we have the information that the author of the question is a Chinese girl, and she studies children's literature at UK. So,
okay.
Thank you for your insights. We have two more raised hands, and now I think we will listen to our colleague from Greece. Artemis, are you still with us? Hello, nice to see you.
It's so nice to see you. Thank you very much for this cycle of presentations. It's very nice to see you again from here. Thank you, dear Krystyna, for this lovely presentation. My mind was bombing all the time with questions and whatever. I was thinking about a lot, like Smiljana, the thing that you said that children's poetry, it's like doesn't exist, only poetry exists. And it is a very interesting perspective and opens a broader philosophical and literary debate, because I think that this viewpoint suggests that poetry, regardless of its implied audience, should be evaluated and appreciated as an art form in its own right, without being confined to age-specific categories. And I was thinking that, first of all, how does this perspective influence maybe the way we critique and understand poetry? Because I was thinking that in our school curriculum in Greece, we choose some poems to introduce to the children, but also this has to do, if the poem is short, if it has to do with play, or etc., or we are very afraid of to put classic poets such as Kavafis. We have Konstantinos Kavafis here. So this was a matter in my mind that we have to, maybe you are very right, that we have to critique poetry as an art form, that it has to do with our personal experiences and not as child's poetry, because maybe sometimes it has to do with childlike, and that has a bad notion maybe. Thank you very much.
Exactly. Thank you very much. It's exactly, you said exactly what I meant. So so thank you very much for appreciation of my talk and such an understanding. I'm absolutely sure that we should assess poetry as such, yeah, and not thinking only about the audience. That's probably the basic thing. So thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Artemis. Thank you very much. One more question from Mohammed and one comment in the chat, and I think that we are going to finish today's meeting.
Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth, for allowing me to speak again. And it is not a question, rather a suggestion, like as Professor Krystyna has already said before, that she had some intentions to do something related to children's literature, and which also involves Asian and African and other languages and literatures from other languages, children's literature. So I would just like to mention that I am translating this particular book. This is in Kashmiri language, and this is an indigenous language. So yeah, so what I was trying to say is that if we can have a forum where we can have some future collaborations with this respect, having Wrocławski, if I'm not wrong, as a partner in the endeavor.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It would be really great. I was dreaming about such a team a few years ago, let's say. Now I'm not sure if I will be able to join as, some tasks to do, yeah, and more obligations. But it's a very good idea. I mean, now we have so many tools that we are able to create such international fora and multicultural, which is more. Yeah, and I think it would be extremely inspiring if we could create such a team to cooperate, to translate, to exchange our experience in working with poetry, writing poetry, reading poetry. So yeah, of course.
Yeah,
I wish you good luck.
Yeah, because why am I saying so, Professor Krystyna? Because the field in India itself is a very, very relatively, it's just like a baby. It's still a child. So, so it needs attention of eminent scholars like all of you. And I'm 21 and I want to see myself on the other side of the table sometime soon. So yeah, and I was learning this, how to say bye in Polish. So it's like do widzenia.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Tell us how to say goodbye in your language.
It's basically Allah Hafiz. So Hafiz means protector. So Allah is God. So you in the hands of God. So we are putting you in the hands of God. So it's Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Awesome.
Okay.
So let me just
thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me just read the comment from the chat, and it will be the very last thing. So a comment question regarding the notion of family poetry. If a poem is good, both children and adults can enjoy it. Thus, perhaps, should all children's poetry, ideally, be family poetry, considering that good poetry is enjoyable for all ages. So this is a comment from the chat from Maria de Rosario. So thank you for this thought-provoking comment. And I think that it's the best concluding comment that we could have had. Thank you so much.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Krystyna, once again for joining us today and for your beautiful, wonderful and inspiring lecture. So many questions, so many comments. It was the best proof that it was very, very interesting for everyone.
Yes.
I'm so happy. You cannot imagine. I'm really happy. Thank you once again for inviting me and for listening to me. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and we would like to invite all of you. We will send you the invitations for the next lecture that will be in March, and we still don't know the exact date, Mateusz.
Yes. So we will let you know.
Yeah, we will let you know. We will send you the invitation. So hope to see you soon in March, and thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you, Ella.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ella, for moderating.
Mateusz, all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Marina.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.